please welcome our final panel, Data Globally. Lisa Sotto, Rob Strayer, and Sean Heather.
Hello, we've reached the final session of what I think has been a series of good conversations about how we get data done right. I'm with the International Division here at the Chamber, and we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 different countries that we are actively engaged in conversations with foreign capitals, where at the top of that agenda often is conversations about what should data governance look like. And what we see are two things. One, that where we in the U.S. have a tendency to not necessarily jump first to regulate, we wait for market failure. Often the tradition in these countries, because they're civil law and not common law traditions, is that they have a strong urge to get out in front and think about how to write a prescriptive approach to these issues. The second thing we see is it's very important to safeguard the ability to move data across borders. If there was a lesson from the 20th century, it would be that finance ministers understood the importance of the flow of capital to one's economy. And we would suggest that in the 21st century, the lesson that governments are going to learn is if we cannot keep data moving in one's economy and we can't keep data moving across borders, that economic growth and the engine for job growth will drive up. So Jules Verne took you around the world in 80 days. We've got 40 minutes. Grab your passports, hold on to your chairs. I've got with us two great Sherpas. We're going to have a very rapid session of a variety of topics that are happening outside of the United States to try to clue you in on what these conversations look like outside of the U.S. So to my left, Lisa Sotto is the partner and head of the cyber and privacy practice at Hunton Andrews Kurth. And Rob Strayer is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications at the State Department. Rob, let me start with you. To set our entire conversation here, give us a sense and tick off the kinds of issues that we see emerging in foreign capitals that read on the question of how to do data right.
Great. First, I want to thank you and the Chamber for organizing this event, and it's a privilege to be here on this panel with Lisa. So there's a vast array of issues are sort of at stake related to the digital economy. So we have things relating to privacy, data protection, cross-border data flows, or the opposite of that, data localization, cybersecurity issues, including certification of technologies, the future of quantum computing, exascale computing, cloud computing, how we're going to process data in the future, as well as artificial intelligence. So all those types of issues are out there. The principles that underlie them are being adjudicated and discussed. We have multilateral organizations, so governments wanting to discuss it, as well as the private sector and non-governmental organizations involved in standards-making bodies. So there's a plethora of different forums discussing all these issues internationally.
I'm not sure we're going to get through all of those, but we'll do our best to hit as many as possible. Lisa, as our privacy expert and having watched the privacy debates unfold around the world, give us a sense of how those debates look today and what kind of GDPR has kicked off around the world.
Sure. Well, I think it's fair to say that every first world country other than the United States has an omnibus comprehensive data protection law in place. And I think we can also say that many third world and second world countries also have comprehensive data protection laws in place. We're at a point in time where we really have three buckets of laws. We have the U.S. Sectoral regime, where we regulate by industry sector. We have the GDPR and its lookalikes, and then the third bucket are the EU directive lookalikes that have not yet revised their laws to move toward the GDPR. However, they're doing that. So we do see, some global trends. We see the GDPR really as the lodestar. It is what is being imitated now, and we can point to Brazil, for example, their upcoming law, very much GDPR-like. Thailand also enacted a law fairly recently, and it looks very much like GDPR. A couple of global trends that I'll just mention. We are seeing countries doubling down on consent as the basis for collecting and using data. I think we've talked enough today about how flawed that model is, and we'll talk a little bit more in the context of artificial intelligence about the flaws in that model. We are seeing also trends toward data localization, another really problematic concept where we are living in a global universe, and data, like water, is ubiquitous and flows everywhere and doesn't respect state boundaries or country boundaries. So data localization is very problematic to the global economy. We're seeing issues with data transfers. Of course, the challenge that the European Court of Justice heard Tuesday, with respect to the Privacy Shield and model clauses, there's that issue. We have Brexit, such that the UK will no longer be considered an adequate country and has to apply for adequacy. And of course, data localization issues hinder data transfers. I'll just also mention a couple of other things. There's a real increase, and I think this is very positive, in embedding accountability and risk-based systems in some of the more recent laws. So that's a good thing. And then one last trend that I'll mention is that DPAs around the world are now very significantly beefing up their resources and their funding. So we're seeing a real change in leadership at the government level with respect to privacy regulators. We're also seeing that shift in companies. Data protection officers, chief privacy officers also are getting more funding, more resources, and gaining in importance within their organizations.
One quick follow-up. When you look at what's happening in these different jurisdictions, do you see a cultural difference on how people are approaching what privacy means?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, at its base, privacy is culturally rooted. So, for example, in the US, and Commissioner Phillips mentioned this, privacy is a consumer protection right. We have had the benefit in our history of never systematically using data to persecute people on the basis of their religion or their ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, in this country, we use data to market people to death. In other countries, they use data to put people to death. So really, you know, fundamental difference. So in the EU, their history points to, is really the reason that privacy is considered a fundamental human right, where data in the World War II era and post-war era was used by governments to create secret dossiers. This is true in Latin America as well, where they have the concept of habeas data. You have a right to see your data, where military dictatorships would create dossiers, and you didn't have the ability to understand what data was being collected about you and used in an adverse way against you. And I'll just give one other example of how privacy is really culturally based, and that is in China. My understanding, if anybody's a Mandarin speaker, you can correct me on this, but my understanding is that in Mandarin, privacy is two words put together. There's not even a word for it, and it's pejorative. So, you know, very interesting, because privacy in China is not really a concept. It's a very, very recent concept in China.
We'll get back to a little more detail on that four-letter word GDPR and what's happening in Europe and what's next, but let's talk for a minute about data localization. We just had the completion of the G20, which is the gathering of the world's 20 largest economies, and President Trump, I think, made a very strong statement at the meeting in Japan against data localization efforts. Rob, could you give us a sense of the ways in which we see data localization efforts popping up in regulation and what's driving those decisions?
Yeah, so there's really probably three main motivations behind these data localization laws. One is a sense that nations want to govern their own privacy there. Another is that there are security concerns about the retention of the data. The third legitimate one, potentially legitimate one, is the way that countries want to ensure that their future uses of that data are available for law enforcement purposes, that is to do prosecutions. The one that we'd say is not legitimate is just pure digital protectionism, that is requiring the onshoring of data or the housing in certain servers within a country as a way to motivate the local economy. So all of those concerns are motivating some of these data localization laws. We've seen one that we're very troubled by in Vietnam. We're also seeing proposals in India. So, what we want to explain to these countries is that, cloud computing, when done with the best practices in mind, can be just as secure, or actually more secure than causing data localization. Data localization causes data to be retained in maybe physical places where it's not the most secure, and it's not done in the most efficient way possible. We've also worked to address law enforcement concerns about cross-border data flows to allow the transfer of that data when appropriate to prosecute major crimes. We passed a law here in the United States in March of last year called the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, or the Cloud Act. So we're taking steps to address those concerns internationally.
And if I'm not mistaken, there are currently, I think, 2 Cloud Act negotiations underway, one with the UK and the other most recently announced was with the European Union.
Yeah, we haven't begun the one yet with the European Union, but that's being discussed. We'd like to get the one done, completed with the United Kingdom first. But yes, the idea is that we would do another whole set of countries after the United Kingdom.
Lisa, you mentioned that you're seeing privacy laws as a vehicle for bringing about data localization measures. Can you expand on some examples of that? And is there ever a reason to say that your data is better protected because it is localized?
No. So to be clear, I really think data localization is a gigantic problem. And I think we need to fight it every step of the way. And Rob, thank you for doing that for us. But look, there's been a lot of talk about, I'll just say, hiding behind privacy and data security to put localization laws in place that really are about either job protectionism or government access to data. So there are, in my view, not appropriate privacy or security concerns here such that localization makes sense. Governments appropriately weigh whether regulation will benefit their citizens or not, but in this case, for example, in the data security context, data security is not about where your data is and where your servers are. It's about a panoply of protections around data, and those protections really can exist anywhere in the world and probably exist better in more centrally located places where companies, cloud providers, can put more resources towards security, rather than having all of these small sort of centers, treasure troves of data where you can't protect the data as well as you could if they're sitting in locations where more resources are being devoted and dedicated to the protection of data.
And as a follow-up, one of the big areas in privacy law that we look to around the world is to what kind of legal mechanisms will be respected for the movement and transfer of data. Can you speak about the range of options that are usually deployed in these laws?
Sure. And let's separate data localization from data transfer, although they are inextricably linked. But they're a little bit different. So, for example, Russia has a localization law. They also have a data transfer restriction requirement. So if you can move your other copy of data, you have to have the initial copy in Russia, but if you can move that, then you have to then follow the data transfer restrictions and have a legal basis in place. Exactly, mirroring of data, exactly right. So what are the mechanisms? There really aren't very many. So we're in a very interesting place right now with the challenge to model clauses and SHIELD, but let me tick them off for you. So model clauses, standard, otherwise known as standard contractual clauses, started in the EU. These are fixed contract clauses that the European Commission has devised. There are 3 sets of model clauses now. And data exporters sign agreements with data importers in third countries, requiring the data importer to put certain protections around the data. And these model clauses have been picked up in other countries like Argentina, which also has its own set of model clauses, as well as other countries. So model clauses, 1. Second, Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield replaced the Safe Harbor when the Safe Harbor was declared by the European Court of Justice to be invalid. The Privacy Shield allows for transfers only from the European Union or the European Economic Area to the US. So it can't be used as a mechanism to move data from the EEA to Singapore, to South Africa, to Kenya, to Chile, it can only be used with respect to the transfers from the EU to the US. So it is very limited that way. Very useful, but limited. Third, binding corporate rules. A tremendously important and vehicle, and a vehicle that has great promise, but is not well conceived at the moment. It takes too much time, it takes too much money, too many human resources to get BCRs in place. It takes a year to 18 months to get BCRs in place. There's really only a handful of companies that have the resources to do that. So that's third. And the fourth is consent, which is a very flawed mechanism for transferring data, because of course if you have a CRM database of 40 million people, you can't get consent from those folks to transfer their data to a third country.
So staying on the theme of what's in the toolkit, Rob, and back to the conversation at the G20, Japan had the chair. They put a big emphasis and focus on this concept of data flows with trust. The idea that we need to develop trust in the ecosystem in order to support data flows between the countries. What does that really mean in practice? And is there any concerns that countries will essentially say, we don't trust you, so therefore we're going to force localize the data?
Yeah, so really the focus at the G20 was to say that we want to continue to recognize that cross-border data flows are very powerful economic tools that we need to ensure continue into the future, that we don't see a balkanization of the internet, that we continue to see innovation and productivity increase through those cross-border data flows. The point about trust is really that there's an obligation by nation states and internationally that we continue to ensure that our values continue to provide confidence to businesses and users that their data is protected and being used in ways consistent with our values, respecting, of course, individual liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and privacy. And then also overlaying that is an independent judicial system that can arbitrate concerns when a legal framework could potentially be violated by the misuse of data. So it's providing that confidence that the statement was oriented toward.
You've already talked a little bit about Privacy Shield. Another mechanism that's out there in this space is Apex CBPR. Can you speak to that a little bit and what that is?
CBPRs were really conceived as an alternative to BCRs, where BCRs are about Europe. CBPRs are for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation nations. And again, another really a vehicle with lots of promise, but there really are only a handful of companies that have put CBPRs in place, because it's a big effort to go through the process of getting them in place, although I think it's probably ultimately going to be easier to do that than to do BCRs. We're getting there with CBPRs. It's a slow process. There hasn't been sort of uniform acceptance. We have in the United States have adopted CBPRs, and that's good. So I think there is great promise to CBPRs, again, for the APEC region, and there's been a significant effort to map the BCR principles with the CBPR principles. So there is an effort to sort of meld, I won't say meld the two, but at least to accept both jointly and to link them. So we'll see how that plays out. I think we're really still in the nascent stage there.
Back to the EU with Privacy Shield, what is clear now is that on an annual basis, the review takes place as to whether or not there continues to be political support to keep Privacy Shield in place. We're going to come up on, I think, the second time, if not the third time, actually, in which that has been reviewed since it was first put in place. How do you see that playing out this fall?
Well, there's so much happening. So the first review went well. There were some issues that were identified, and in the second review, the Commission noted that there was improvement with respect to the items that were identified as needing improvement in the first review. The biggest thing that was noted in the second review was our lack of an ombudsman. Now we have one, and the Senate confirmed an ombudsman just a couple of weeks ago. So that's great.
And that rolls over at the State Department.
That rolls in the State Department, yeah, which is just terrific. So, and we should be very proud of the fact that we have somebody in place to deal with the issues that might arise. we're in a difficult place right now with the Privacy Shield and with model clauses, both. So both of these tools for transferring data are being challenged. And remember, there are about 5,000 or so entities that have certified to the Shield and use the Shield as the basis for transferring data. And just about every other company in the world uses model clauses. So these are, and those have been in place for 20 years. So both mechanisms are being challenged. That would leave us with BCRs, remember, very difficult to put in place, and consent. Both of these vehicles are being challenged right now in the what originally was the Schrems II case. This was heard in I'm told, an 8-hour hearing on Tuesday at the Court of Justice. Really, really painfully long and laborious hearing. And there is the possibility that both mechanisms are going to be declared invalid. And then we're going to be in a world of hurt, I think, from the perspective of global data flows.
Definitely something to stay tuned to. The last tool I want to talk about in the toolkit is the work that was done through USTR and the trade negotiations around updating NAFTA and what is called the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which needs to obviously clear Congress. But it was the first of its kind agreement that will go before Congress that really puts out a very ambitious series of obligations in the trade space to speak on the digital economy and making sure that the way in which people are thinking about regulating and moving does not do so in a kind of a trade restrictive manner. Can you speak to some of the provisions that are in there and what that might mean for future negotiations?
Yeah, we really think the USMCA is precedent setting in its digital trade chapter. Of course, it facilitates cross-border data flows, but it also explicitly minimizes the ability to restrict storage and where the computing occurs within the region. It also has prohibitions on countries demanding to see source code and the algorithms. So as we move more and more to AI and other proprietary uses of data, it's going to be important that those restrictions be in place and that companies don't feel that their vital trade secrets are subject to countries asking them to be handed over. So it's got a number of mechanisms that ensure that we see the freest flow of data through US, Mexico, and Canada.
But there's also an emphasis on cyber and the importance of cooperation between the US, Canada, and Mexico.
Yep.
Let's get back and drill down a little bit more in GDPR. We're a year into its implementation. What can we say about it, Lisa?
Well, companies have spent a fortune to comply. And, I think it's fair to say that most companies are quite a ways down the road. We talk about the fact that full compliance is well nigh to impossible. I think that really is true. But there's been an enormous effort to get down the road of compliance. And it's really made a very, very significant difference. So a couple of notes, sort of footnotes here to what we're seeing now following the one-year anniversary. There is an absolutely overwhelming number of complaints to DPAs. They're very clear about the fact that they're being overwhelmed by the number of complaints and in the number of breach notifications. So we're going to have to normalize that in some way, or these, the regulators just will not be able to keep up at all. We had, until this week, seen really very limited enforcement. The biggest case that had been out there was the one against Google by the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, for 50 million euros, alleging a lack of transparency in use of data. But this week, back to back, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK issued gigantic notice of intent to fine both Marriott and British Airways. One was for $240 million, the other was $124 million, roughly, when translated from the various currencies. So these are very, very significant potential fines. There is the ability to appeal, but we'll see what happens there. I think a couple of other impressions. There are significant challenges still to organizations. There was a very laudable goal in implementing the GDPR toward harmonization, and it is we're doing pretty well on the harmonization front, but what we're seeing also is that there's enough that's not harmonized that it is wreaking a little bit of havoc. There are different interpretations among the different DPAs, and some DPAs are not respecting the one-stop shop mechanism, so they're initiating audits, they're starting enforcement actions, they're initiating investigations without going to the relevant supervisory authority. So not quite as rosy as we had hoped on the harmonization front.
What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of GDPR? And for those who are still writing legislation, including here in the United States, what should we copy from GDPR and what should we make sure we leave behind?
So there are two pieces that I think are really commonly misunderstood and problematic. One is data breach. In the data breach area of GDPR, we all know very well there's a 72-hour notice requirement, and you have to notify your supervisory authority if there is a risk to the rights and freedoms of affected individuals. So risk means there is a harm threshold, but it's a very light harm threshold. And with the potentially enormous fines that come along with a failure to report, if there were an allegation that somebody should have reported and didn't, for that particular provision, there's a potential fine of 2% of global turnover. So it's enormous, which means that companies are really not taking the risk, and there is so much over-reporting. So this is an area we're going to have to come to some sort of agreement on because this is not sustainable at its current rate of reporting. The second significant misconception is that companies still believe that if they have an EU consumer, then they're subject to the GDPR. That is not correct. There are very specific territorial scope provisions in the GDPR, and we're still seeing a lot of unease and misconception around that concept. So what should we pick up? What shouldn't we pick up? So I think we have to think about the basic data protection principles that are embedded in the GDPR, and certainly, and we've talked about them ad nauseum today on lots of panels, but things like transparency, individual rights, critically important. This is not something that can be left behind in a U.S. law. Harmonization, I just can't stress that enough. We've certainly stressed it during the day today. Harmonization means not having 50 state laws and having one federal law that is the standard that everybody complies with, because it doesn't make any sense for somebody in California to have more rights than somebody in Kentucky or Connecticut or New York. So harmonization is so critical. Building privacy in from the start, privacy by design, privacy by default, instead of retrofitting for privacy, a very important concept. And I would also press for a risk-based regime. Not all data is the same, not all risks are the same, so we need to think about what protections to put in place based on the risk that a particular technology will impose, based on the risk that particular data will impose on individuals.
Very quickly before I go back to Rob, you mentioned kind of backhanded earlier on the follow-on efforts that are coming down the pike in Europe, one of which is e-privacy regulation. What is it, and what is its interface with GDPR?
Yeah, we're in a bit of a purgatory period right now with the e-privacy regulation, because the GDPR and the e-privacy regulation really need to dovetail and work hand in glove. Unfortunately, we have the GDPR and we have the old e-privacy directive. The e-privacy regulation is still being hammered out, and it's going to be a while. We're certainly not going to see a new e-privacy regulation anytime soon. But they do dovetail, because the e-privacy directive addresses the electronic, the sending of electronic direct marketing communications, and to do targeted marketing, you have to use cookies. Cookies collect personal data. So we have to think about the GDPR on the one hand, we have to think about the e-privacy directive at present on the other, and they don't dovetail well. We really do need that sort of second piece of it, the e-privacy regulation, to be put in place so that we can stop being in this bit of purgatory and really have these connected rules in place together.
Staying with Europe, but coming back to you, Rob, there has been, I think, a view here in Washington that at times Europe's out to get American companies, and particularly American tech companies. I think about the fact that 5 years ago at the start of the current commission, and for those who don't know, the European Commission every 5 years is kind of formed, and it has a mandate and has a work program, and we're at the end of this 5-year period and about to launch into a new one. At the beginning of this commission's work, one of the things they wanted to do was create a digital single market, and a lot of the noise around it was to say that we need to do this to make Europe more competitive and to find ways to bring American companies down a notch. I'm not sure I've seen that play out, but what would you say you've seen as a result of the digital single market work and some of the criticisms that we've at times feel that perhaps they're targeting American firms?
Yeah. The goal behind, or the conceptualization that there'd be a digital single market uniting 500 million consumers that we could more easily do business with rather than deal with 28 separate regulatory regimes is an important goal. Of course, it hasn't really been achieved in the last 5 years. I think one of the most significant changes would be the effort to prohibit the localization of non-commercial data so that it continues to flow more freely around the European Union. But many of the areas that they've attempted to regulate, as Lisa noted, they lack the harmonization. So we see a lot of cases where there's not a uniform requirement across. There's too much room for interpretation that then allows for different regulatory structures to apply to each country.
Moving on to AI, the OECD recently released AI principles. Do you see political energy forming in countries around the world to move to regulate AI?
We're definitely in a status where AI is getting more and more attention. We were very pleased to sign on to these AI principles that were hammered out over a course of several months with our very active involvement at the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a large group of the most industrialized countries. We think that was a very good forum because we were able to have input from the private sector. There will be increasingly calls for regulation related to AI. We're very concerned that regulation could suppress innovation and development before we know how AI can develop in all these different areas. So we have an executive order that we issued this spring in the Trump administration focusing on thinking about ways that we can ensure that there's sound standard setting processes and that are also being led by various agencies within the government that have a role related to AI. So NIST has just recently put out a roadmap for engaging in these standard setting bodies. So I think it's important that we step out there and seek to have solutions that are voluntary, consensus-based, and led by the private sector, rather than having regulatory models that would initially regulate rather than see what the private sector can do to address these concerns beforehand.
And the current commission in Europe had commissioned a group of experts to issue some thoughts on AI and recommendations. That report is now out there and is public. With this new commission that will be formed this fall, do you think AI might take center stage in Europe as a program of work for the next commission?
Yeah, it absolutely will be, with the focus not just in OECD, but we saw AI as an issue that came up in the G20. I foresee that we will have an active engagement with the European Union and the European Commission going forward on AI.
Let's spend a couple minutes on cyber. If Europe has been out ahead of us on GDPR, we certainly have been out ahead of Europe with our NIST cyber framework. Briefly, what is that and how is it going in terms of our efforts to go and educate the rest of the world about taking a kind of risk-based approach and a more voluntary approach to cyber?
Yeah, exactly. Just as you said, this NIST approach was built with a lot of input from the private sector, but very importantly, it's focused on a risk-based approach rather than a prescriptive regulatory approach. So, the tendency with cybersecurity, because it tends to evolve over time in response to threat actors, is that if you are to just set up a check-the-box set of measures that you can meet in any static time, that will not protect you in the long run, and you'll immediately fall behind. In fact, you'll identify for your adversaries which areas that you're not going to be protected in because they're not on the list. So it's really important you take a risk-based approach to that. As we talk around the world, I think we've been, the finest form of flattery is the emulation that we've gotten. A lot of countries have basically adopted the NIST cyber framework. Last spring, we put out the 2.0 version of that, and it focuses more on critical infrastructure and supply chain risk too. So we've continued to update that, but it's a really good model.
And there's an effort underway, if I'm not mistaken, to take that NIST framework and make it an international standard within ISO.
Yeah, exactly. So, these international standard setting bodies, have the input of the private sector at the same time, and it's, that allows there to be that kind of the true experts at the table, between the academics, the technologists, and government officials to help hammer out the best path forward. But again, taking a risk-based approach rather than a prescriptive one.
And how does that NIST approach, this risk-based, differ from what Europe is doing, which is through a thing called the NIS directive, or for that matter, China?
Yeah, so we're concerned that there could be efforts in, whether in Europe, they recently passed another cybersecurity law that would set up a construct where they would set up profiles and then have an attempt to certify technology as it comes out. We don't think that's going to be sustainable in the long run. It also could lead to a real siloing of standards. So you'd have to make one set of product standards for Europe, one for China, one for India, one for the United States, and that's not going to be good in the long run. And because it's static, it's not going to evolve to meet the challenges of the future from the adversaries who are going to inherently react to whatever standards are put forward now.
Before we move to wrap up, Lisa, you also obviously lead the cyber practice. How do you see the interface between these cyber laws that are now coming online in these markets interfacing with these new privacy laws that are on the books?
Yeah, it's interesting because we, look, cyber and privacy are two sides of the same coin. And we tend to separate them here in the United States, query whether they should be separated. But in Europe, and in many other countries, security is built into the data privacy law, as is data breach, both in the data protection law. And then separately, we have things like the NIS directive, which is a distinct requirement in Europe, and it's a directive, I'll note, rather than a regulation. So it has to be transposed into the various member states. I think there is a set of burdens imposed on companies because they need to think both about the privacy law in a country and about the cybersecurity law. And in many cases, there's an overlap. So, for example, if there is a data breach that involves personal information that also affects, for example, critical infrastructure, there may be a reporting obligation to two separate regulators. So there is a bit of a burden there. It would be nice if they would dovetail more than they are. But I think, again, we're in the very early stages of really understanding how these obligations fit together, and hopefully over the next few years we'll be able to streamline.
Well, we're about out of time. I think there's a number of issues that we're not going to get to, things like facial recognition, what's happening with big data and competition enforcement, deeper questions about law enforcement access to data. But one issue that I'll close with, and a question to you, Rob, some people may have seen that the government of France this morning passed a new digital service tax. There's been an effort, including the Chamber, to make the argument that the need to think about how we tax digital services, it needs to be a conversation that is multilateral, one led out of the OECD. France decided to move out ahead of everybody. Any closing thoughts on what digital service tax might look like around the world in those conversations? Like, there's more than 30 jurisdictions that have thought about the importance of thinking about tax policy in the digital era.
Yeah, clearly, the trade in goods and services is going to evolve into the future. That's why we need to think holistically about it in places like the OECD, which we think is the best venue for that. Unfortunately, we think the French attempt at a digital services tax is going to be discriminatory against our companies and our interests. So yesterday, the U.S. Trade Representative announced that we're starting an investigation under the Section 301 to look into that practice and consider our remedies against it if it's found to be in violation.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of this session. I think, going back to where we started at the beginning, one of the things to be watching for is that often these issues, because of the traditions to move quicker than we do here in the U.S. to regulate, these issues are likely to keep us very busy in engaging in foreign capitals, and we look forward to continuing the partnership we've enjoyed with the U.S. government and with our members in taking on that fight. Thank you both for being here. This concludes the session.